When you come across the word fascism, what first comes to your mind? When I was young and naive, I used to believe that guys in Guy Fawkes masks were fascists. We used to watch Hollywood movies on a cheap VCD player back in the day with children of my age on a lone local color TV. There was Jurassic Park, Lion King, Terminator 2, you name it, indecently ripped from DVDs with the blue FBI anti-piracy seals because there was no legit movie store where I lived. Power would cut out intermittently. Sometimes we got to watch the second disc 3 or 4 days later. When we watched V for Vendetta in the mid-2000s, every time the masked guy came out, I used to think, he really must be a fascist. Boy, that was some time we lived in. The word fascism has nothing to do with faces or masks, as I have gullibly believed it to be. It was originated in the 1920s during the Mussolini's rule in Italy. It comes from the Italian fascismo, from fascio meaning bundle, political group. So, who are the fascists? But first we have to understand the nature and its various attributes. If you think of the totalitarian governments that ruled Europe before the Second World War, you can easily say that it would be difficult for them to reappear in the same form in different historical circumstances. Any new fascist movement will be totally different from the old fascism. Even though various Nazi-like movements have arisen all over the world, especially in Europe and North America, the Nazism in its original form will not reappear as a nationwide movement. Political regimes can be overthrown, and ideologies can be criticized and disowned. Behind a regime and its ideology, there is always a way of thinking and feeling, a group of cultural habits, of obscure instinct and unfathomable drives. A specter of communism, maybe. A ghost stalking all over the world. The victories of the American people and their allies, as Franklin D. Roosevelt said, will be a victory against fascism and the dead hand of despotism it represents. During the Second World War, the Americans who fought in the Spanish War were called premature anti-fascist. It means that fighting against Hitler in the 40s was a moral duty for every good American, but fighting against the military general Francisco Franco in the 30s seemed despicable because it was mainly done by communists and other leftists. Cops who did not approve of smoking were called fascist pig by American radicals 30 years later. Mein Kampf is a manifesto of a complete political program that has the Nazi theory of racism and of the Aryan chosen people. A precise notion of degenerate art, a philosophy of the will to power, and of the Übermensch, the ideal superior man of the future as described by Nietzsche in his Also sprach Zarathustra. Nazism was decidedly anti-Christian and neo-pagan that attempted to revive the ancient polytheistic religions of Europe and the Middle East. Whereas Stalin's Diamat, the official version of Soviet Marxism, was materialistic and atheistic. They were both true totalitarian regimes. However, Italian fascism was certainly a dictatorship, but it was not totally totalitarian because of its weak, flimsy philosophical ideology. Fascism in Italy had no special philosophy. Mussolini had no philosophy, only rhetoric, and he was only a militant atheist. Italian fascism was the first right-wing dictatorship that took over a European country. It was the first to establish a military liturgy, a folklore, even a way of dressing far more influential with its black shirts than Armani, Benetton, or Versace would ever be. It was Italian fascism that convinced many European liberal leaders that a new regime was carrying out interesting social reforms, and that it was providing a mildly revolutionary alternative to the communist threat. Fascism was a fuzzy totalitarian, a collage of different philosophical and political ideas, a beehive of contradictions. The Fascist Party was born boasting that it brought a revolutionary new order, but it was financed by the most conservative landowners who expected it from a counter-revolution. There was no strict cultural line in Italian fascism. Take Futurism. One might think it was a great movement along with Expressionism, Cubism, or Surrealism. But the Italian futurists were nationalists. They favored Italian participation in the First World War for aesthetic reasons. They celebrated speed, violence, and risk. all of which somehow seem to connect with the fascist cult of the youth. They identified themselves with the Roman Empire and the rediscovered rural traditions. They circulated new ideas without any real ideological control. The regime tolerated their blatant dissent. This does not mean that the Italian fascism was tolerant. Deaths everywhere, and prison. Fascism, philosophically, was out of joint, fastened to some archetypal foundations. Fascist game can be played in many forms, and the name of the game does not change. Fascism became an all-purpose term because one can eliminate from a fascist regime one or more features like imperialism or colonialism or anti-capitalism or cult of mythology, and it will still be recognizable as fascist. So how do you identify a fascist? These are a list of features that are typical of what Umberto Eco, the Italian philosopher and novelist, would call eternal fascism. These features cannot be organized into a system. Many of them contradict each other and are also typical of despotism or fanaticism, but it is enough that one of them can be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it. The first feature is the cult of tradition. Some 2,000 years ago, in the Mediterranean basin, people of different religions started dreaming of a revelation received at the dawn of history. This revelation had remained for a long time concealed under the veil of forgotten languages. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, in the Celtic runes, in Viking stories, in the scrolls of the religions of Asia. This new culture had to be syncretistic, that is, the combinations of different forms or belief or practice. Such a combination must tolerate contradictions. Too much of this bred new religions. Each of the original message contained some supposed wisdom, and whenever they seem to say different or incompatible things, it is only because all are alluding allegorically to the same primeval truth. As a consequence, there can be no advancement of learning. No new learning can occur, only further refinement and reinterpretations. Truth has already been spelled out once and for all, and we can only keep interpreting its obscure message. Science rotted and festered under its relentless lies. Even at the risk of internal contradiction, they seem to accept all its atrocious attributes. The second feature is the rejection of modernism. Only saris for women in India, no jeans, no short pants, more like. Both fascists and Nazis worship technology. Even though Nazism was proud of its industrial achievements, its praise of modernism was only the surface of the ideology based upon blood and Boden, blood and earth. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. The third one is Irrationalism. It also depends on the cult of action for action's sake. Action being beautiful in itself must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. Do you know what emasculation means? It's not empowerment of men. Vaccines cause autism, 5G towers cause COVID-19, pigeons are government spies. Distrust of the intellectuals has always been a symptom of fascism, as Hermann Goering said. When I hear talk of culture, I reach for my gun. The official fascist intellectuals were mainly engaged in attacking modern culture and liberal intellectuals for betraying traditional values. They will attack science whenever they can. The fourth one is disagreement is treason. No syncretistic faith can withstand criticism. The critical, skeptical spirit makes distinctions, and to distinguish is a sign of modernism. Scientific community today praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. For a fascist, disagreement is treason. For them, critical reasoning is a barrier to action, as well as out of fear that any analysis will expose the contradictions embodied in a syncretistic faith. The fifth one is the fear of difference. Fashion grows up and seeks for consensus by exploiting and exacerbating the natural fear of difference. The first appeal from them is against intruders. They are racist by definition. They are homophobic. The sixth feature is derived from individual or social frustrations. The most typical feature of the historical fascism was the appeal to a frustrated middle class suffering from an economic crisis or feelings of political humiliations. Fascism in the future will find its audience in this new majority. The seventh is the obsession of a plot and the hyping up of an enemy threat. To people who feel deprived of a clear social identity, the fascists say that their only privilege is to be born in the same country. This is the origin of nationalism. According to them, the only ones who can provide an identity to the nations are its enemies. The easiest way to solve is the appeal of xenophobia, the dislike of people from other countries. They are obsessed with the plot, that it must come from the inside. The eighth feature is that the followers are made to feel humiliated by the wealth and force of their enemies. The followers must also be convinced that they can overwhelm the enemies. They continuously shift the rhetorical focus. The enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. The fascist governments are condemned to lose wars because they are constitutionally incapable of objectively evaluating the force of the enemy. The ninth feature. For a fascist, there is no struggle for life, rather life lived for struggle. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy, because life is permanent warfare. There must always be an enemy to fight. This brings to the Armageddon complex. Since enemies must be defeated, there must be a final battle, after which the movement will have control of the world. But such a final solution implies a further era of peace, a golden age which contradicts the principle of permanent war. No fascist leader has been able to come up with a solution to this predicament. The 10th. The contempt for the weak. It advocates a popular elitism. Every citizen in a fascist regime belongs to the best people of the world. The members of the party are the best among the citizens. Every citizen can or ought to become a member of the party. The leader, knowing that his power was not given to him democratically, but was taken by force, also knows that his force is based upon the weakness of the masses. They are so weak as to need and deserve a ruler. Since the group is hierarchically organized according to the military model, every subordinate leader despises his own underlings, and each of them despises his inferiors. This is the mass elitism. The 11th is the perspective that everyone should be educated to become a hero. In every mythology, a hero is an exceptional being, but in a fascist regime, heroism is the norm. The cult of heroism is linked to the cult of death. In non-fascist societies, the public is told that death is unpleasant, but must be faced with dignity. Believers are told that it is the painful way to reach a supernatural happiness. By contrast, fascist hero craves heroic death, advertised as the best reward for a heroic life. The hero is impatient to die. Blow up before a school full of kids? No problem in that too. The 12th is machismo. Fascists transfer their will to power to sexual matters. Here comes the disdain for women, and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits. They sublimate the difficult work of permanent war and heroism into the sexual sphere. They are concerned more about abortion and what goes under a skirt. Texas, Handmaid's Tale. The 13th is based on selective populism. In democracy, the citizens have individual rights, but the citizens in their entirety have a political impact. For a fascist regime, individuals as individuals have no rights, and the people is perceived as a quality, a monolithic entity expressing the common will. Since no large quantity of human beings can have no common will, the leader pretends to interpret their will. Citizens do not act. They are only called upon to play the role of people. People is only a theatrical fiction. The fascist regime is always against the rotten parliamentary government. Whenever a politician doubts the legitimacy of the parliament because it no longer represents the voice of the people, you can smell fascism. The last one is the newspeak, a term coined by George Orwell in 1984 as the official language of the English socialism. Fascism employs and promotes an impoverished vocabulary in order to limit critical reasoning. People are crazy and times are changing, so be reasonable and calm down. Now the moment you have all been waiting for. Subscribe to the channel and maybe comment whatever comes to your mind. Also, go to www.buymeacoffee.com/chungthem if you are into donating to other people's works.